There will come a time when the universe no longer contains anything that can be called active in the way we understand activity today. A time when stars are gone, galaxies have thinned into isolation, and even black holes, the most enduring structures ever formed, have reached the end of their long persistence. This is not a moment marked by an explosion or a collapse, not a dramatic finale written into the fabric of space, but a gradual transition so slow that no clock could meaningfully track it. A future where change itself becomes rare not because physics breaks down, but because there is almost nothing left for physics to act upon. Black holes are often spoken of as eternal, as final objects that consume everything and remain forever, yet even they are not exempt from the universe's deeper rules. Given enough time, even the darkest and most massive structures must yield, not violently but quietly, through a process so subtle that it barely feels like an event at all. When the last black hole finally fades, the universe does not end, pause, or reset. It continues into a state that is stranger than destruction and calmer than silence, a condition where existence persists without anchors, without memory, and without anything left to dominate. To understand what comes after the last black hole dies, we have to let go of the idea that endings must look like endings. There is no final collapse, no universal blackout, no last flash of energy announcing that something important has happened. Instead, the universe enters a regime where time still passes but stops accumulating meaning, where space continues to expand but no longer separates things that can ever interact again. Black holes were the universe's ultimate long-term organizers, the final places where mass, energy and geometry could still concentrate enough to matter. Once they are gone, there are no more engines of structure, no remaining systems capable of amplifying differences into consequences. What remains is not emptiness in the familiar sense, but an evenly diluted reality where particles drift, radiation thins, and nothing is capable of shaping anything else on a scale that lasts. This is not a future that waits for something to happen. It is a future where waiting itself no longer applies. This video is not about fear, speculation, or spectacle. It is about following the universe forward using the same laws that govern it now, allowing them to carry us beyond stars, beyond galaxies, and beyond black holes themselves. If you enjoy slow, thoughtful journeys through deep time and cosmic structure, consider subscribing to Theories Before Sleep, where we explore reality without rushing it, and where ideas are allowed to unfold at the pace the universe itself prefers. From here, we move step by step toward the longest future imaginable, not to witness an ending, but to understand what remains when even the most permanent things are finally gone. Long before the universe reaches the moment when the last black hole disappears, it passes through stages so extended that even calling them eras begins to feel misleading, because eras imply beginnings and endings that can be pointed to, while these transitions unfold across spans of time so vast that no clear boundary separates one condition from the next. To understand what happens after the last black hole dies, it is necessary to first understand why black holes outlast almost everything else in the universe, and why their persistence is not a sign of invincibility, but of efficiency. Black holes are not eternal because they are special in a mystical sense, but because they represent one of the most stable configurations matter can achieve under gravity. Once matter collapses beyond a certain threshold, all internal resistance disappears. There is no pressure pushing outward, no fuel to burn, no structure left that can fragment or decay. What remains is mass wrapped into geometry, held together not by force in the usual sense, but by the shape of space-time itself. This makes black holes extraordinarily long-lived, not because time favours them, but because there are very few mechanisms capable of undoing them. In a universe where stars explode, galaxies collide, and particles decay, black holes remain almost unchanged, quietly persisting while everything else transforms around them. This persistence has led to the intuition that black holes are the final state of matter, the ultimate leftovers after cosmic evolution has run its course. But this intuition is incomplete. Black holes are stable, but they are not immune to the deepest trend governing the universe, which is not destruction, but dilution. The universe does not remove things by smashing them apart. It removes relevance by spreading everything thinner over time. The process that eventually erodes black holes is not violent or obvious. It does not resemble decay as we usually imagine it. There is no cracking, no fragmentation, no sudden release of energy. Instead, there is a slow, nearly imperceptible leakage that arises not from the black hole's interior, but from the quantum structure of space-time around its event horizon. According to our best understanding, empty space is not truly empty. It is filled with fluctuations, transient pairs of particles and antiparticles that appear and disappear constantly. Near an event horizon, these fluctuations can be separated by gravity, allowing one particle to escape while the other falls inward. To an outside observer, this appears as radiation emitted by the black hole itself, a process known as Hawking radiation. The key detail is not that black holes emit radiation, but that this radiation carries away energy. Energy and mass are equivalent. As radiation escapes, the black hole loses mass. This loss is extraordinarily slow for large black holes. For stellar mass black holes, the timescale is already far beyond the current age of the universe. For supermassive black holes, the timescale stretches to numbers that defy intuition, extending across durations so long that writing them out becomes meaningless. Yet slow does not mean never. Given enough time, the mass loss continues. There is no mechanism that stops it. No equilibrium is reached. The black hole shrinks, gradually, silently, without any dramatic signal that the process is underway. As the universe ages, other sources of energy disappear one by one. Stars exhaust their fuel and fade. White dwarfs cool. Neutron stars lose their heat. Galaxies drift apart beyond causal contact as space expands. Eventually, black holes become the dominant repositories of mass and energy simply because everything else has already settled into quieter states. For a long stretch of cosmic history, black holes are the most active structures left, not because they are energetic, but because they are still capable of interacting. They can merge, they can accrete the occasional stray particle, they can emit faint radiation through quantum effects. But even this activity diminishes as the universe continues to expand and thin. Matter becomes scarce, encounters become rare, mergers cease. What remains are isolated black holes drifting in an ever-darkening cosmos, each one slowly losing mass through Hawking radiation, each one on a countdown that no observer will ever witness from start to finish. This is the context in which the death of the last black hole must be understood. It is not an event embedded in a lively universe. It is the final ripple in a reality that has already become almost completely static. The phrase "the last black hole" can be misleading because it suggests a moment when one object remains and then suddenly vanishes, leaving behind a clear before and after. In reality, there is no sharp boundary. Black holes evaporate at different rates depending on their mass. Smaller ones disappear first, larger ones last longer. Supermassive black holes persist the longest, not because they are protected, but because their surface temperature is extraordinarily low, making their radiation output almost negligible. As time stretches onward, even these giants shrink. Their event horizons contract. Their temperatures rise slightly as they lose mass, accelerating the final stages of evaporation. But even this acceleration unfolds over immense spans of time. When the final black hole reaches the end of its evaporation, the universe around it is already so dilute, so cold, and so empty that the release of energy, however energetic locally, has no wider impact. There are no nearby systems to absorb it, no structures to respond, no observers to mark the moment. The black hole does not explode in a cosmic sense. It simply finishes losing the last of its mass, leaving behind radiation that disperses into an already nearly uniform background. Nothing dramatic follows. Nothing reorganizes. The universe does not react because there is nothing left capable of reacting. This is where intuition often fails because we expect the death of something so massive and enduring to matter. We expect consequences, but consequence requires contrast. It requires a system where differences can propagate, where energy flows can shape structure. By the time the last black hole dies, the universe no longer has that capacity. Energy gradients are almost entirely flattened. Space is vast beyond comparison. Particles are separated by distances so large that interactions are vanishingly rare. The radiation released by the final evaporation does not ignite anything, does not trigger any chain reaction, does not mark the beginning of a new phase. It simply adds to the background, indistinguishable from everything else already spread thin across space. This is not an ending in the narrative sense. It is a completion of a process whose significance has already faded. What follows the death of the last black hole is not a new era of activity, but a continuation of quiet that was already well underway. The universe enters a state where there are no longer any gravitational sinks capable of concentrating mass or energy. Without black holes, there are no structures left that can meaningfully gather matter. What remains is a universe dominated by low-energy radiation and isolated particles drifting through expanding space. Time still exists, space still expands, physical laws still apply, but there is no longer anything that uses those laws to create new structure. Change becomes local, fleeting, and inconsequential. A particle may decay, a rare interaction may occur. But nothing builds upon these events. They do not accumulate. They do not cascade. Each occurrence stands alone, disconnected from what came before and unable to influence what comes after. The universe does not freeze. It does something stranger. It continues without developing. In this condition, familiar concepts begin to lose their meaning. Temperature still exists in principle, but there is no system large enough for temperature to matter. Time still orders events, but events no longer form histories. Distance still separates points, but separation no longer prevents interactions that would have happened anyway, because there are almost none left to prevent. Even the idea of an object becomes ambiguous, because objects imply boundaries that matter, and boundaries require interaction to be meaningful. What remains is existence without emphasis. Not emptiness, but neutrality. Not silence, but the absence of anything left to hear. This is why asking what happens after the last black hole dies is not really a question about a moment, but about a condition. The universe does not cross a finish line. It settles into a state where nothing remains capable of shaping its future in a way that differs from its present. The future becomes statistically indistinguishable from the present, not because time stops, but because time no longer produces change that accumulates. The laws of physics still permit motion, interaction, and fluctuation, but permission alone is not enough to generate consequence. Without gradients to exploit, without concentrations to amplify, processes occur without leaving marks. The universe becomes a place where everything that can happen still happens, but so weakly and so briefly that it does not matter. This realization reframes the death of the last black hole not as a dramatic finale, but as the removal of the final anchor of structure. Black holes were the last places where the universe could still gather itself, still form something resembling a center. Once they are gone, there are no centers left, no focal points, no engines of organization. The universe becomes fully decentralized, not in a political or metaphorical sense, but in a physical one. There is nowhere left for anything to collect. There is nowhere left for anything to begin, and yet nothing is broken. Nothing has failed. This outcome is not a collapse. It is the natural result of a universe governed by expansion, entropy, and conservation, allowed to unfold over enough time. After the last black hole has finished evaporating, the universe does not enter a new phase in the way earlier transitions unfolded, because earlier phases were defined by the emergence or disappearance of structures that could still shape their surroundings. This time, there is no replacement. Nothing new rises to take the role black holes once played. The universe simply continues without any remaining mechanisms capable of organizing matter or energy on large scales. What follows is not an era of absence, but an era of uniformity, where differences exist only fleetingly and never accumulate into anything that can persist. The removal of black holes marks the final loss of gravitational hierarchy. Until that point, no matter how sparse the universe became, there were still locations where mass was concentrated enough to bend space-time decisively. Places where trajectories converged and where history could still be written locally. Once those are gone, space-time becomes almost perfectly smooth on all accessible scales. Curvature remains in principle, but it is so weak and so evenly distributed that it no longer produces focal points. Without focal points, there are no centers. Without centers, there are no systems. Without systems, there is no longer a meaningful distinction between structure and background. The universe after the last black hole dies is not empty in the intuitive sense. There are still particles, still radiation, still fields permeating space. But none of these elements are arranged in ways that allow complexity to arise. Particles are separated by distances so vast that interactions become extraordinarily rare. Radiation is stretched to wavelengths so long that its energy is negligible. Fields exist, but with amplitudes so small and variations so smooth that nothing can be built from them. Everything that remains is evenly diluted, not clustered, not organized, not evolving toward new configurations. This is the state sometimes described as the heat death of the universe, but that phrase carries misleading connotations of exhaustion or collapse. Nothing has broken down, nothing has failed. The universe is still obeying its laws perfectly. What has changed is that those laws no longer generate novelty. The capacity for difference has been exhausted, not because all possibilities are forbidden, but because all remaining possibilities lead to the same outcome: uniformity. Time still exists in this universe, but it no longer plays the role we associate with it. Earlier, time was a driver of change. It allowed processes to unfold, structures to form, histories to diverge. Now, time becomes a bookkeeping parameter, ordering events that do not build upon one another. A particle may decay, but the products drift apart without consequence. A rare interaction may occur, but it does not seed further reactions. Each event is isolated, disconnected from what comes after. Without memory, without accumulation, time loses narrative power. It does not point forward. It does not mark progress. It simply continues. The future becomes statistically indistinguishable from the present, not because nothing happens, but because what happens never matters beyond itself. This flattening of temporal significance is one of the most difficult aspects to grasp, because human experience is built around sequences where earlier events shape later ones. In the post-black hole universe, that chain is broken. Cause and effect still exist locally, but they no longer propagate into histories. Space too undergoes a subtle shift in meaning. Expansion continues, driven by the same underlying dynamics that have been operating for billions of years. Galaxies were once carried apart by this expansion, then stars within galaxies drifted into isolation, then even remnants lost contact. After the last black hole, expansion no longer separates things that could have interacted, because there is nothing left that could meaningfully interact at large scales. Distance still increases, but distance no longer functions as a barrier, because barriers imply something trying to cross them. In this universe, there is nothing left trying to go anywhere. Motion exists, but without destination. Trajectories exist, but without convergence. Space becomes a medium of separation without consequence. One of the most profound consequences of this state is the disappearance of scale as a meaningful concept. Earlier in cosmic history, scale mattered immensely. Being larger meant exerting greater influence, shaping more matter, persisting longer. After the last black hole, scale becomes decorative. A particle here or a particle there makes no difference. A region slightly denser than another will smooth out before anything can arise from it. Without mechanisms to amplify differences, size no longer leads to dominance. Everything exists on roughly equal footing, not because everything is identical, but because nothing can leverage its differences into impact. The universe becomes egalitarian in the most literal physical sense. There are no privileged locations, no special objects, no centers of action. This is not balance achieved through regulation, but balance achieved through exhaustion. In this condition, familiar physical concepts remain valid but hollow. Energy is conserved, but there is no meaningful flow of energy from one system to another, because there are no systems. Entropy continues to increase, but its increase no longer changes anything observable, because entropy is already near its maximum. Temperature exists as an average property of radiation, but without matter to respond to it, temperature has no role. Even gravity, the most universal of forces, becomes almost irrelevant. With no large masses left, gravitational interactions are weak and diffuse, unable to organize anything beyond trivial transient pairings. The universe is not governed by new laws. It is governed by the same laws, operating in a regime where their outcomes are minimal. This is where intuition often rebels, because we expect a universe without black holes to feel empty, dead, or extinguished. But extinction implies loss, and nothing has been lost in a meaningful physical sense. All that has happened is that the universe has explored its capacity for structure and found that capacity finite. The transition is not tragic, because tragedy requires preference. The universe does not prefer structure over uniformity. It simply follows what is statistically inevitable given enough time and expansion. Structure arises when gradients exist. When gradients fade, structure fades with them. This is not a moral arc, it is a thermodynamic one. Without black holes, there is also no longer any place where the universe can hide complexity. Black holes once acted as repositories, places where mass and information could be sequestered behind horizons, effectively removed from the rest of the universe's dynamics. When they are gone, everything that remains is exposed, not in the sense of being revealed, but in the sense of being spread thinly everywhere. There are no hidden corners, no deep wells, no reservoirs of potential. Everything that exists is already everywhere it can be. This eliminates the possibility of surprise. Surprise requires concentration. It requires a store of energy that can be released unexpectedly. In the post-black hole universe, there are no such stores left. The disappearance of surprise leads to the disappearance of meaning as we usually define it. Meaning arises from difference, from the idea that one outcome matters more than another. When outcomes converge, meaning dissolves. This does not imply that the universe becomes meaningless in an absolute sense, because meaning was never an intrinsic property of the universe. Meaning was a relationship between observers and structures capable of affecting them. Once observers are gone and structures flattened, that relationship ceases. The universe does not lose something it possessed. It simply continues without something it never required. It is important to emphasize that nothing in this picture requires speculation beyond established physics. No exotic decay, no sudden phase transitions, no violations of conservation laws. The universe after the last black hole dies is a straightforward extrapolation of processes already underway. Expansion, cooling, dilution, and entropy increase. The strangeness of this future does not come from unfamiliar mechanisms, but from familiar ones, carried to their logical extreme. This is why it feels unsettling. We are not confronted with something alien, but with the quiet end of difference itself. In this state, even the concept of after becomes slippery. After implies a sequence where one condition replaces another in a way that matters. But once the last black hole is gone, there is no further replacement. The the universe does not transition into something else. It settles into a condition that persists indefinitely, changing only in ways that never accumulate into new structure. Asking what happens next becomes less meaningful than asking what remains. What remains is a universe where existence persists without direction, without memory, and without emphasis. Not frozen, not destroyed, but functionally complete. Once the universe has settled into this condition where no structures remain capable of dominating their surroundings, something subtle but profound happens to the idea of possibility itself. Possibility does not vanish, because the laws of physics still permit interaction, motion, and fluctuation. What vanishes is the ability for those possibilities to matter. Earlier in cosmic history, small differences could grow into large consequences. A slightly denser region could become a star. A slightly hotter core could ignite fusion. A chance encounter could trigger a cascade of events that reshaped entire systems. In the universe that exists after the last black hole is gone, those amplification pathways are closed. Differences still arise, but they dissolve before they can accumulate into anything persistent. A fluctuation may briefly appear, but without surrounding structure to reinforce it, the fluctuation fades back into uniformity. A rare interaction may occur, but it does not seed further interactions. Each event stands alone, disconnected from any larger narrative. Possibility remains in principle, but disappears in practice. This is one of the most difficult transitions to grasp, because it is not marked by loss of motion or loss of law, but by loss of leverage. Nothing pushes back against uniformity strongly enough to escape it. In this regime, the universe becomes functionally complete. Not complete in the sense that nothing exists, but complete in the sense that nothing further changes the overall condition. Completion here does not imply an ending, because endings require contrast with continuation. Instead, it implies sufficiency. The universe no longer requires additional states to express what it is capable of expressing. All accessible configurations are statistically equivalent. Probability flattens. Outcomes no longer diverge in ways that create history. The universe continues to evolve microscopically, but macroscopically it remains the same. This distinction between microscopic activity and macroscopic stasis is crucial. At small scales, particles still move, fields still fluctuate, and quantum processes still occur. At large scales, none of this matters. There is no mechanism to convert small-scale activity into large-scale structure. The bridge between scales has collapsed. Without that bridge, activity becomes noise without signal. Time, under these conditions, undergoes a quiet transformation. It does not stop, it does not loop, it does not break. It simply loses relevance as a driver of difference. In earlier eras, time mattered because later states depended strongly on earlier ones. History accumulated. Choices, even probabilistic ones, had consequences. In the far future, time still orders events, but ordering no longer implies direction. There is no sense in which the universe is heading somewhere, because all destinations are equivalent. The future does not offer novelty. The past does not contain lessons. Both dissolve into a continuous present where change occurs without accumulation. This is not stagnation, it is neutrality. The universe is not frozen, it is indifferent to sequencing. Asking what happens next becomes less meaningful than asking what changes if something happens at all. The answer, increasingly, is nothing. Space continues to expand, but expansion itself loses significance. Expansion once mattered because it separated regions that could have interacted, reshaping cosmic structure and isolating systems. In the late universe, there are no systems left to isolate. Everything that could be separated already is. Expansion becomes a geometric fact without consequence. Distances grow, but nothing is trying to cross them. Horizons exist, but there is nothing beyond them that would have mattered even if it were reachable. The universe grows larger, but largeness no longer adds anything. Size becomes a background parameter, not a feature. One of the deepest consequences of this state is the disappearance of comparison. Comparison requires reference points that persist. Earlier, it made sense to compare stars, galaxies, black holes, because their differences had effects. One burned faster, one shaped more matter, one dominated its environment longer. In the universe without black holes, comparison collapses. Differences exist momentarily but do not persist long enough to serve as reference. Without reference, categories dissolve. There is no meaningful distinction between one region and another beyond trivial fluctuations. This erases the last traces of hierarchy. The universe becomes flat not only in energy distribution but in significance distribution. Nothing stands out long enough to be noticed, even in principle. This flattening has implications for information itself. Information is not just data. It is data that can be preserved, transmitted, and used to influence future states. In earlier eras, information was stored in structures, in the arrangement of matter, in the states of systems that could endure. After the last black hole, there are no durable information stores left. Any information encoded in particle arrangements is rapidly lost to dispersion. Correlations decay. Memory fades, not because something erases it intentionally, but because nothing remains to hold it. The universe does not forget. It becomes unable to remember. This is a subtle but critical distinction. Forgetting implies a process that removes information. Inability to remember implies the absence of structures capable of storing it. The latter is what occurs. Information is not destroyed in violation of physical law. It is rendered inaccessible, spread thinly across space until it cannot be reconstructed in any meaningful way. This condition exposes the true nature of entropy, which is often misunderstood as disorder. Entropy is not chaos. It is the measure of how evenly possibilities are distributed. In the late universe, entropy is near its maximum, not because everything is messy, but because everything is uniform. There are no gradients left to exploit. Energy exists, but it is evenly spread. Matter exists, but it is sparsely distributed. Fields exist, but they vary so smoothly that nothing can be extracted from them. High entropy is not noise, it is equilibrium. The universe reaches a state where it has explored all the differences that matter and smoothed them out. What remains is not destruction, but completion. At this point, even the concept of evolution loses relevance. Evolution implies selection among alternatives, the idea that some configurations persist while others vanish because they are better suited to conditions. In the late universe, all configurations are equally unsuited to producing change. Selection has nothing to act upon. There is no environment in which one arrangement has an advantage over another. Everything that can exist does exist briefly, and everything dissolves at roughly the same rate. Evolution does not stop because it is forbidden, but because it is pointless. Without differential survival, there is no trajectory. The universe does not improve or degrade. It simply remains. It is tempting to describe this future as empty, silent, or dead, but these words import expectations that no longer apply. Emptiness is defined relative to fullness. Silence is defined relative to sound. Death is defined relative to life. In the late universe, these contrasts no longer exist. There is nothing to compare against. The universe is not empty. It is evenly filled. It is not silent. It lacks systems capable of generating or receiving sound. It is not dead. It no longer supports the conditions under which life makes sense. These are not failures. They are outcomes. The universe has moved beyond the regimes where these categories had meaning. What remains is existence without emphasis. Reality continues without highlighting any part of itself. There are no peaks, no valleys, no focal points. Everything that happens everywhere in essentially the same way. This does not require a collapse into sameness at the microscopic level. It requires sameness at the level that matters for structure. Differences still flicker, but they do not persist. They do not propagate. They do not organize. They do not matter beyond the instant they occur. This state also dissolves the idea of destiny. Destiny implies a trajectory toward a particular outcome, a sense that the universe is going somewhere specific. In the late universe, there is no trajectory left to follow. The universe has passed all landmarks. There is no next milestone, no final state waiting to be reached. What exists now is what will continue to exist, changing only in ways that never accumulate into something different. The universe does not arrive anywhere. It does not miss any destination. It simply continues under constraints that no longer generate novelty. Crucially, nothing about this condition contradicts the beginning. The same laws that allowed the universe to produce stars, galaxies, and black holes also allow it to settle into neutrality. The beginning did not contain a promise of perpetual complexity. It contained the conditions for complexity to arise temporarily. Once those conditions played out, the underlying laws remained. The late universe is not a betrayal of the early universe. It is its statistical fulfillment. Given enough time, expansion, and entropy, this outcome is not just possible, it is inevitable. Not because the universe seeks equilibrium, but because nothing prevents it. In this sense, the death of the last black hole is not the end of something meaningful, but the final confirmation that meaning was always contingent. Meaning arose because systems capable of caring existed within a window of cosmic conditions that favoured contrast and accumulation. Once that window closed, meaning didn't disappear from the universe. It disappeared with the systems that generated it. The universe itself remains unchanged by this loss. It does not require meaning to exist. It does not require observation to be real. It does not require memory to persist. The most unsettling realization is not the universe becomes quiet, but that it does so without resistance. There is no struggle, no collapse, no tragedy written into the process. The universe does not fight entropy. It does not mourn the loss of structure. It simply continues under the same rules that once made structure possible. The late universe is not an error state. It is the default outcome of consistency applied over infinite time. What remains then is not a void, but a condition where existence persists without pressure to become anything else. There is no urgency, there is no scarcity, there is no accumulation. The universe has become functionally complete, not because it has achieved a final form, but because nothing further alters its behavior in a way that matters. It does not anticipate the future, because anticipation requires difference. It doesn't recall the past, because recall requires structure. It simply continues, carrying the same laws forward into a reality where those laws no longer generate stories. In this condition, even asking what happens next loses context. The universe does not unfold anymore. It remains. And in that remaining, the death of the last black hole stands not as a dramatic ending, but as the quiet removal of the final structure that once allowed the universe to emphasize any part of itself over any other. As this long continuation unfolds, the universe enters a condition where not only events become rare, but even the possibility of meaningful events grows increasingly faint, not because the laws of physics forbid them, but because the conditions required for these events to matter no longer exist. Possibility in earlier epochs was shaped by contrast. Differences in energy, density, and structure allowed one outcome to occur instead of another, and those outcomes mattered because they could influence what followed. When stars existed, there were possibilities for birth and death, for ignition and collapse, for light to begin or fade. When matter clumped, there were possibilities for chemistry, for planets, for complexity. In the late universe, these contrasts have been stretched almost perfectly flat. Energy has spread so evenly that no region can exploit it. Density variations smooth out before they can amplify. Structure no longer forms because nothing reinforces it. Possibility still exists in principle, embedded in the equations that govern reality, but it loses leverage. Outcomes no longer diverge in ways that create consequence. The laws of physics still permit interaction, fluctuation, and motion. Particles can still collide. Fields can still ripple. Quantum uncertainty still produces fleeting variations. But permission alone is not enough to generate significance. Without gradients to exploit, without concentrations to amplify, processes occur without leaving marks. A fluctuation may arise, but it dissolves immediately into uniformity. A rare interaction may occur, but it does not cascade into further change. Nothing builds upon itself, nothing accumulates. Possibility remains mathematically available, but practically irrelevant. The universe becomes a place where everything that can happen does happen, but so weakly and so briefly that it does not alter the overall condition in any lasting way. This is not a universe frozen in time. Motion continues everywhere. Change still occurs at the smallest scales, but motion lacks memory. Change does not stack. Each event stands alone, disconnected from what came before, and unable to influence what comes after. In earlier eras, history existed because events shaped the conditions for future events. Now that chain is broken. The distinction between randomness and order becomes meaningless, because both rely on comparisons across outcomes that persist. Randomness implies that outcomes differ. Order implies that those differences follow patterns. When differences dissolve immediately, neither category applies. The universe no longer explores new configurations because all accessible configurations are statistically equivalent. Probability flattens into sameness. This does not mean that the universe becomes simple in its rules. The laws governing reality remain as rich and intricate as ever. Symmetry, conservation, causality, and quantum structure all persist. What changes is not the laws, but their expression. The same rules that once generated galaxies now generate nothing more than gentle, inconsequential motion. Complexity was never written into the laws themselves. It was written into the conditions under which those laws operated. Once those conditions are gone, complexity fades without resistance. Time still orders events, but events no longer define eras. There is no meaningful sense in which one stretch of time differs from another. 1 billion years passes, then another, then 1 trillion. Each interval looks essentially the same from the perspective of large-scale structure. Time no longer functions as a narrative dimension. It becomes parameter without direction. The idea of progress loses relevance, because progress implies movement toward a different state. Here, all states are functionally equivalent. The future does not improve upon the present, and the present does not differ meaningfully from the past. Space continues to expand, but expansion no longer changes relationships that matter. Distances increase, but nothing is trying to bridge them. Horizons exist, but nothing beyond them could influence anything, even if contact were possible. Space becomes a vast, continuous medium where separation has no practical consequence. Location loses importance. There is no center. There is no edge. There are no privileged regions. Everything that exists everywhere in essentially the same way. Energy still exists, but it no longer flows in ways that produce structure or direction. Energy flow requires imbalance. In the late universe, imbalance is rare and short-lived. Any localized concentration disperses before it can do work. Work becomes impossible not because energy is gone, but because energy is too evenly distributed. This is one of the most counterintuitive aspects of the far future. The universe does not run out of energy. It runs out of usable energy. The distinction is subtle, but crucial. Energy remains conserved, but usefulness depends on gradients, and gradients have been erased by time and expansion. In earlier epochs, the universe was dynamic not because its laws were different, but because conditions allowed differences to grow. Small variations could be amplified into stars, planets, and living systems. Now, those conditions are gone. The universe does not resist this transition, because resistance would require an alternative state to prefer. Preference is not a physical property. The universe does not choose uniformity. It arrives there because nothing prevents it. Continuation replaces transformation, not as a goal, but as an inevitability. At this stage, even the concept of evolution loses relevance. Evolution implies selection among alternatives, the idea that some configurations persist while others vanish because they are better suited to their environment. In a universe where all alternatives lead to the same outcome, selection has no effect. The environment no longer favors anything. Everything that exists persists briefly and dissolves at roughly the same rate. There is no advantage to be gained. No pathway leads somewhere different. Evolution does not end. It becomes irrelevant. The universe does not choose its future, because choice is not a physical process. It follows what is statistically inevitable given enough time and enough expansion. Possibility becomes evenly distributed across space, diluted until it no longer concentrates anywhere. The universe is no longer a place where something could happen. in a way that changes the whole. Instead, it becomes a place where everything that happens is local, fleeting, and forgettable. This does not represent exhaustion, but saturation. Exhaustion implies that something has been used up. Saturation implies that everything available has been evenly spread. All pathways have been explored, not sequentially but probabilistically. Nothing new stands out because nothing remains to distinguish new from old. The beginning of everything once allowed possibility to concentrate, creating conditions where small differences could grow into worlds. That same beginning also ensured that possibility would eventually diffuse, stretched thin by expansion and entropy. This outcome is not tragic or meaningful in itself, because meaning was never part of physical necessity. Meaning was something that arose within temporary systems capable of noticing difference and caring about consequence. The universe does not miss the era when possibility was rich, because missing requires memory. It does not long for complexity because longing requires desire. Those qualities belong to transient arrangements of matter, not to the universe as a whole. What remains is a cosmos where existence persists without potential for transformation, not because transformation is impossible, but because it is irrelevant. At this scale, even asking whether something could happen loses context, because context depends on consequence. The universe becomes functionally complete, not because it has reached a final form, but because nothing further alters its behavior in meaningful ways. Completion here does not imply closure, but sufficiency. The universe requires no additional states to express what it is capable of expressing. It does not anticipate the future, because anticipation requires difference. It does not recall the past, because recall requires structure. It simply continues. The idea of destiny dissolves entirely, because destiny implies a trajectory, and trajectories require landmarks. The universe has passed all landmarks. What remains is not a destination, but a condition. The beginning of everything is still present, not as a memory, but as an underlying constraint embedded in geometry, constants, and symmetry. The same constants that allowed stars to burn now allow particles to drift. The same geometry that allowed galaxies to form now allows space to stretch endlessly. Nothing about the universe contradicts its origin. It fulfills it statistically, not narratively. The universe does not fail to become something more, because becoming more was never required. It becomes what its rules allow over infinite time. In this sense, the universe is neither optimistic nor pessimistic. It is indifferent, because indifference is simply the absence of preference. The fading of possibility does not mark an end, because ends require contrast with continuation. Instead, possibility becomes uniform, spread everywhere and nowhere at once. Everything that can occur still occurs, but nothing matters enough to stand out. The universe does not arrive at silence because silence implies an expectation of sound. It arrives at neutrality, existence without emphasis, continuation without variation. A reality where nothing needs to happen for everything to remain exactly as it is, and yet nothing is broken, nothing is missing. The universe has not failed to achieve something it owed itself. It has simply followed the only path available once its initial conditions were allowed to play out fully. Existence continues beyond this point not as a story unfolding, but as a condition that sustains itself without requiring interpretation. The universe no longer behaves like a system moving through stages, because stages imply transitions that lead somewhere different. What exists now does not lead elsewhere. It maintains itself through consistency rather than change. This persistence is not stagnation, because stagnation implies frustration of motion. Motion still occurs, particles still drift, fields still fluctuate, quantum uncertainty still expresses itself endlessly. What has vanished is not activity, but consequence. Nothing that happens reshapes the overall state. The universe has become a place where events occur without leaving marks, where change exists without accumulation, and where continuity replaces progression as the dominant feature of reality. In this condition, the distinction between existence and non-existence becomes subtle in ways that resist ordinary intuition. Earlier, existence meant presence within systems that interacted, exchanged energy, and produced outcomes that differed from alternatives. Now, existence persists without interaction in any meaningful sense. Particles exist, but they rarely meet. Radiation exists, but it does not heat anything. Fields exist, but they do not organize matter. Existence becomes a passive property rather than an active one. Things are not doing anything in a way that alters what follows. They are simply there, embedded in a universe that no longer asks anything of them. This passivity does not violate any physical law. It arises naturally once all processes capable of amplifying difference have completed their work. The universe has not lost its rules. It has exhausted their capacity to generate structure. In this way, the late universe resembles a solved equation rather than a dynamic problem. All variables remain defined. All constraints remain enforced. But no new solutions emerge. The system has settled into a state where further computation yields the same result repeatedly, regardless of how long it is allowed to run. Time itself undergoes a quiet demotion. It remains as an ordering principle, but not as a driver of difference. Earlier, time mattered because it separated causes from effects in ways that built histories. Now, time separates events that never connect. The arrow of time, once defined by the growth of entropy, still points forward, but it points into a landscape that no longer changes in any meaningful way. Entropy continues to increase, but the increase does not alter anything perceptible. The arrow remains, but the terrain flattens beneath it. In this flattened temporal landscape, the idea of forever loses its emotional weight. Forever is meaningful only when contrasted with endings. Here, there are no endings left to contrast against. The universe does not approach a final moment. It simply extends. Continuation without transformation becomes the dominant mode of existence. This is not an achievement or a failure. It is the natural outcome of consistency applied over unlimited time. Even the concept of identity becomes unstable. Identity requires persistence and distinction. Something must remain recognizable as itself across change. In the far future, nothing changes enough to establish identity, but nothing persists in a way that allows recognition either. Particles exist, but their states drift. Radiation exists, but its wavelength stretches. There is no stable configuration to anchor identity. Everything exists as process without profile. This erasure of identity is not annihilation, it is diffusion. The universe does not destroy what it contains, it spreads it until boundaries lose significance. Boundaries are what allow one thing to be distinguished from another. Without them, everything remains, but nothing stands apart. The universe becomes continuous in a way that resists segmentation. At this point, even the concept of after becomes misleading. After implies succession with difference. But once the last black hole is gone, succession persists without difference. Asking what happens after becomes equivalent to asking what happens during any arbitrary stretch of time. The answer remains the same: small-scale motion, large-scale sameness. Nothing accumulates, nothing escalates, nothing resolves. This condition does not require collapse, decay of laws, or exotic physics. It is simply the long-term behavior of a universe governed by conservation, expansion, and probability. The same principles that once produced stars and galaxies now produce quiet persistence. The universe does not contradict itself. It fulfills itself. The beginning of everything is still present, not as a moment remembered, but as a constraint that continues to shape what is possible. The constants that allowed complexity also allowed uniformity. The geometry that once curved into galaxies now stretches into emptiness. The same framework supports both richness and neutrality. Nothing about the late universe erases the early universe. It extends it. What disappears is not reality, but narrative. Narrative depends on contrast, on the idea that one state leads meaningfully to another. Without contrast, narrative dissolves. The universe does not tell stories anymore, because stories were never part of its structure. They were temporary overlays created by systems capable of tracking difference. Once those systems fade, reality remains uninterpreted. This does not imply that the universe becomes unreal. Reality does not require interpretation to exist. It requires only that nothing prevents it from existing. In the far future, nothing does. Existence continues because there is no mechanism that would stop it. Stopping would require an edge to time or a collapse of law. Neither occurs. The universe does not close. It does not conclude. It does not reach a final state in the dramatic sense. It simply persists in a configuration where nothing further distinguishes one moment from another in a way that matters. This persistence is not boredom, because boredom requires awareness. It is not peace, because peace implies relief from tension. It is neutrality. In neutrality, the universe no longer resists or strives. It does not balance opposing forces, because opposing forces have faded. It does not seek equilibrium, because equilibrium has already been achieved. It does not move toward rest, because motion never ceases. It simply exists under conditions that no longer generate emphasis. What remains is not absence, but sufficiency. Reality no longer needs to become anything else to express what it is capable of expressing. All that can happen still happens, but nothing stands out. Everything that exists is already everywhere it can be, changing only in ways that never accumulate into difference. This is not an ending that resolves a mystery. It is the realization that mystery itself was temporary. Mystery depends on the expectation that something new might emerge. Once that expectation fades, mystery dissolves without being solved. The universe does not answer its own questions. It outlasts the ability to ask them. Existence continues without urgency, without memory and without direction. Not because something has gone wrong, but because nothing remains that could go right or wrong in a meaningful sense. The universe persists as it always has, obeying the same laws, carrying the same constraints forward, not toward a destination, but into continuity itself. And in that continuity, the absence of black holes is not a loss. It is simply the completion of the last process that once allowed the universe to emphasize one part of itself over another. Everything that follows unfolds quietly, not as a finale, but as what remains when nothing is left to resolve. Existence stretches onward beyond this state without interruption, not because it is being sustained by any mechanism, but because nothing interrupts it. The universe no longer behaves like a system moving through problems to be solved or configurations to be optimized. It behaves like a condition that simply holds. Holding does not imply effort, it implies stability. Stability here is not achieved by balance between opposing forces, but by the absence of forces capable of opposing anything meaningfully. Everything that could have introduced instability has already dissipated. What remains is a universe that is no longer negotiating its future. It is simply carrying forward what it already is. In this regime, the relationship between cause and effect becomes increasingly local and increasingly inconsequential. Causes still produce effects, but those effects do not propagate. A decay event produces particles, but those particles drift apart without influencing anything else. A fluctuation briefly alters a field, but the alteration smooths out before it can be reinforced. Causality has not broken down, it has become self-contained. Each causal chain terminates almost immediately, not because it is forbidden to continue, but because there is nothing left for it to interact with. The universe still computes outcomes, but the results are never reused. Nothing is fed back into the system in a way that changes its trajectory, because the idea of a trajectory has lost meaning. This is where the concept of memory finally dissolves completely. Memory is not simply information stored somewhere, it is information that persists long enough to influence the future. In earlier epochs, memory existed in many forms, in the structure of galaxies, in the chemical composition of stars, in the genetic information of living systems, in the correlations between particles. Memory allowed the universe to build upon itself. In the far future, nothing lasts long enough to serve as memory. Correlations decay, structures dissolve, patterns fade. Information is not destroyed in violation of physical law, but it's dispersed so thoroughly that it can no longer be accessed or reconstructed. The universe does not remember its past because it lacks the capacity to store it in a way that matters. Without memory, repetition becomes indistinguishable from novelty. If the same type of event occurs again and again, but no trace of previous occurrences remains, then each event is effectively new and identical at the same time. The distinction collapses. This undermines the idea of cycles. Cycles require recurrence with recognition. In the late universe, recurrence may occur statistically, but recognition is impossible. Nothing persists to notice that something has happened before. The universe does not repeat itself in any meaningful sense, because repetition requires continuity of context. Context has dissolved. This also removes the last foundation for expectation. Expectation depends on patterns observed in the past and projected into the future. Without memory, there can be no expectation. The universe does not anticipate anything, not because anticipation is forbidden, but because anticipation is not a physical process. It is an emergent feature of systems that track change. Once those systems are gone, Anticipation disappears without trace. The future is not awaited. It arrives continuously without distinction from the present. In this condition, the idea of scale becomes almost decorative. Earlier, scale determined influence. Larger structures shaped smaller ones. Massive objects dominated their surroundings. After the disappearance of the last black hole, scale no longer confers power. A region slightly denser than another cannot grow into anything larger. A particle with slightly more energy cannot trigger a cascade. Differences in size exist, but they do not translate into differences in effect. The universe becomes scale invariant in practice, not because everything is the same size, but because size no longer matters. This scale indifference has a subtle implication for geometry itself. Space-time continues to exist with whatever curvature remains, but curvature no longer organizes matter. Geometry becomes a passive backdrop rather than an active participant. In earlier epochs, curvature guided motion, focused trajectories, and created wells that trapped matter and energy. In the late universe, curvature is so gentle and so uniform that it doesn't create destinations. Motion exists, but it is unguided. Paths do not converge. Nothing falls into anything else. The universe becomes geometrically smooth in a way that removes directionality from motion. Energy too loses its narrative role. Energy is often described as the currency of change, the ability to do work. In the far future, energy still exists, but the ability to do work has vanished. Work requires the movement of energy from one place to another in a way that produces a lasting change. Without gradients, energy cannot be harnessed. It can only drift. The universe does not run out of energy. It runs out of opportunities to use it. This is one of the most profound lessons of the far future. Abundance without utility is indistinguishable from absence. At this point, even the concept of survival becomes meaningless. Survival implies persistence in the face of threats, selection against unfavorable conditions. In the late universe, there are no threats and no conditions to adapt to. Everything that exists persists until it dissolves, and everything dissolves at roughly the same rate. There is no struggle, no competition, no advantage. Survival was always a local phenomenon dependent on scarcity and pressure. Once scarcity and pressure are gone, survival loses its context. The disappearance of struggle does not imply peace in any meaningful sense. Peace implies relief from conflict. Conflict requires opposing interests or forces. In the far future, there are no interests, no forces in opposition. The universe is not peaceful, it is neutral. Neutrality is not an emotional state. It is a structural one. Nothing is being balanced because nothing is competing. This neutrality also dissolves the idea of failure. Failure implies that something did not achieve its purpose. The universe does not have purposes, it has behaviors. Those behaviors play out according to law. The late universe is not a failed attempt at complexity. It is the natural outcome of allowing complexity to exhaust the conditions that made it possible. There is no disappointment embedded in this outcome because disappointment requires expectation. The universe had none. As this condition persists, the distinction between existence and persistence becomes subtle. Existence continues, but persistence no longer accumulates into history. Each moment exists, but moments do not stack into narratives. Time flows, but flow no longer produces direction. The universe does not arrive anywhere. It does not approach a final configuration in the dramatic sense. It simply remains in a configuration where further change does not matter. This persistence is not static. At the smallest scales, quantum fluctuations continue indefinitely. Virtual particles appear and disappear. Fields fluctuate. But these fluctuations never escape their local context. They never scale up. They never produce structure. They are motion without outcome. The universe becomes a sea of microscopic activity floating in macroscopic sameness. At this point, the idea of observation becomes not just impractical, but incoherent. Observation requires a system that can interact with something else, record the interaction, and be altered by it in a lasting way. In the far future, nothing can fulfill all three conditions simultaneously. Interactions are too rare. Recording is impossible without memory. Alteration does not persist. Observation ceases to be a meaningful concept. The universe is not unseen. It is unseeable. This unseeability is not darkness. Darkness implies the absence of light relative to sight. Sight implies observers. Without observers, light and darkness lose their relational meaning. Radiation still exists, but it does not illuminate anything. It simply propagates until it is stretched thin by expansion. The universe is not dark. It is uninterpreted. What remains, then, is a reality that exists without reference. Reference requires comparison. Comparison requires persistence. Persistence requires structure. Structure is gone. The universe exists without anchoring any perspective. There is no preferred frame, not because relativity demands it, but because nothing remains to define preference. This condition also removes the last justification for asking why. Why questions imply that something could have been otherwise, and that the difference would matter. In the far future, nothing could have been otherwise in a way that changes the present. All alternatives converge. Asking why the universe is the way it is becomes equivalent to asking why consistency persists. There is no deeper answer, because there is no deeper difference to explain. The most striking feature of this future is not its emptiness, but its sufficiency. The universe no longer requires additional states, events, or structures to express its nature. Everything that can be expressed has already been expressed. What remains is not absence, but completeness. Completeness without culmination. Fulfillment without resolution. Existence continues without urgency, because urgency requires scarcity. Scarcity is gone. Everything that exists everywhere it can. There is no lack, but also no excess that can be exploited. The universe is not waiting. Waiting implies anticipation. Anticipation implies difference. Difference has faded. This does not mean that the universe is finished. Finished implies that something has stopped. Nothing stops. Motion continues, time continues, law continues. What has ended is the production of novelty. Novelty was always a temporary feature of a universe far from equilibrium. Once equilibrium is approached, novelty dissolves without ceremony. In this sense, the disappearance of the last black hole was not a dramatic event, but the final confirmation that the universe had crossed a threshold from becoming to being. It no longer becomes something else. It simply is, and that being persists, not as a destination reached, but as the only condition left that remains consistent with the laws that govern reality. Existence carries on into spans of time so vast that even the idea of duration begins to lose its usefulness, not because time stops, but because nothing remains that could use time to become something else. In earlier epochs, time mattered because it separated moments that were meaningfully different from one another. 1,000,000 years could transform a cloud into a star, a planet into a living world, a civilization into dust. In the far future, 1,000,000 years, 1,000,000,000,000 years, or a number beyond counting differ only numerically, not structurally. Each interval passes without altering the overall condition. Time still orders events, but ordering no longer implies development. The universe does not advance. It persists. This persistence reshapes the idea of continuity itself. Continuity once meant the connection between states that built upon one another, a thread running through change. Now continuity becomes sameness extended indefinitely. There is no rupture, but there is also no progression. The universe does not move toward rest, because motion never ceases. It does not move toward complexity, because complexity requires conditions that no longer exist. It remains in a narrow corridor of possibility where everything that can happen happens without accumulating into difference. In this regime, the distinction between foreground and background dissolves. Earlier structures stood out against a backdrop of emptiness. Stars shone against darkness, galaxies clustered against voids, black holes dominated their regions of space-time. After the last anchors are gone, there is no longer anything that can stand out. Everything that exists blends into everything else. The universe becomes all background. There is no foreground left to draw attention. This does not require uniformity at every scale. It requires uniformity at the scales that matter for influence. Small fluctuations remain, but they never become features. The disappearance of features also erases the final trace of directionality. Direction implies asymmetry. It implies that one way leads somewhere different than another. In the late universe, all directions are equivalent. Moving forward or backward, outward or inward, leads to the same condition repeated endlessly. Space may still have geometry, but geometry no longer points toward anything. Motion loses its sense of journey. It becomes drift without destination. This drift does not imply aimlessness, because aimlessness presumes the possibility of aim. In the far future, aim is not absent, it is irrelevant. Nothing is trying to achieve anything. The universe is not a system striving toward balance. Balance has already been achieved. It is not maintaining balance through regulation. It is balanced because nothing remains to disrupt it. One of the most difficult adjustments for intuition is letting go of the idea that existence must justify itself through outcomes. Human thought is shaped by environments where survival depended on anticipating change and responding to it. We are conditioned to look for purpose, function, and payoff. In the far future, these concepts lose traction. The universe does not produce outcomes to be used. It does not generate functions to be fulfilled. It does not optimize for anything. It simply persists because persistence is the default state once all destabilizing factors have faded. In this condition, the concept of scarcity disappears entirely. Scarcity once drove structure. It forced matter to clump, energy to flow, systems to compete. When energy was unevenly distributed, work was possible. When matter was concentrated, gravity organized it. When resources were limited, complexity emerged. In the late universe, scarcity is gone. Everything that exists everywhere it can, spread so thinly that nothing lacks anything relative to anything else. Abundance without concentration replaces scarcity with no utility. Without scarcity, there is no pressure. Without pressure, there is no adaptation. Without adaptation, there is no story. The absence of story does not imply absence of reality. Reality continues, but it no longer narrates itself through change. It does not require explanation, because nothing remains that would be affected by explanation. Explanation is a tool for navigating difference. When difference fades, explanation becomes ornamental. The universe does not need to be explained to itself. It simply follows what is allowed. This also dissolves the final traces of hierarchy. Hierarchy depends on differences in influence, power, or persistence. Earlier, massive objects shaped smaller ones. Energetic systems dominated quieter ones. Long-lived structures outlasted fragile ones. In the far future, hierarchy collapses not through revolution, but through irrelevance. Influence becomes negligible everywhere. Persistence becomes uniform. Nothing lasts in a way that matters more than anything else. The universe becomes flat in significance, not because everything is identical, but because nothing has leverage. This flattening extends to causality itself. Cause and effect still exist locally, but they do not propagate into chains that matter. A cause produces an effect, but the effect does not become a cause for anything else. Causality becomes terminal rather than generative. Each chain ends almost as soon as it begins. The universe still obeys cause and effect, but cause and effect no longer organize time into meaningful sequences. In such a universe, the idea of inevitability also changes. Earlier, inevitability referred to outcomes that would occur regardless of intervention. In the late universe, inevitability becomes trivial. Everything that can happen will happen, but none of it matters. There is no sense in which one outcome is more inevitable than another, because all outcomes converge into the same overall condition. Inevitability loses its weight because it no longer points toward anything distinct. This convergence does not require a final collapse or a last event. There is no universal punctuation mark. The universe does not announce its arrival at neutrality. It slides into it gradually, so gradually that no boundary can be drawn. The last black hole does not mark a turning point in experience, because there is no experience left to be marked. It marks a turning point only in abstraction, in our attempt to understand how structure finally exhausts itself. Beyond this point, the universe does not decay into nothingness. Nothingness would imply absence. What exists is presence without differentiation, presence without emphasis. Everything that exists continues to exist under the same rules, but those rules no longer generate contrast. Contrast was never guaranteed. It was a temporary condition allowed by uneven beginnings. The beginning of everything contained a symmetry. Energy was concentrated, matter was dense, space was compact. These asymmetries allowed change to be dramatic. As the universe expanded, those asymmetries smoothed out. The smoothing did not remove reality. It removed the conditions that made reality dramatic. What remains is the long, quiet expression of the same laws that once produced fireworks. This future also reframes the idea of permanence. black holes once seemed permanent because nothing else lasted as long. Their disappearance reveals that permanence is always relative. What lasts longest defines permanence only until something lasts longer. In the far future, nothing defines permanence because nothing persists in a way that matters. Everything that exists persists, but persistence itself no longer distinguishes anything. Permanence becomes meaningless not because nothing lasts, but because everything lasts equally without consequence. The disappearance of consequence is perhaps the most unsettling feature of this state. Consequence implies that actions matter beyond themselves. In the late universe, nothing has consequences that extend beyond the moment. Events happen, but they do not shape anything else. The universe does not punish or reward. It does not respond. It simply absorbs events into sameness. This absorption is not destructive. It is smoothing. The universe becomes the ultimate low-pass filter, allowing motion but removing impact. Everything that happens is softened until it blends into the background. Sharp edges vanish. Extremes dissolve. What remains is continuity without emphasis. In this continuity, even the notion of existence as something special fades. Existence becomes the default rather than the exception. There is no alternative state to contrast against. Non-existence is not a reachable condition. The universe exists because nothing removes it from existence. It does not need to be sustained. It does not need to be justified. It simply continues under laws that have no termination clause. This continuation does not aim toward renewal. There is no rebirth waiting beyond neutrality. Renewal would require a mechanism to reintroduce a symmetry. None exists. The universe does not cycle back to its beginning. Cycles require memory and recurrence with difference. The late universe has neither. What remains is a reality where the question, what happens next, no longer applies, because nothing that happens next differs meaningfully from what is happening now. The universe does not enter a new chapter. It remains in a condition where chapters are no longer written. And yet this is not an error state. It is not a failure of imagination or physics. It is the most conservative outcome possible, the persistence of law without the drama of outcome. The universe continues to be exactly what its rules allow it to be when allowed to run without interruption for infinite time. Existence remains not as a narrative, not as a process aimed at something else, but as a condition that holds because nothing opposes it. That is not an ending, it is what remains when endings lose relevance. Existence extends even beyond this condition without introducing any new frame that would allow it to be interpreted as entering a different phase, because the very idea of phases depended on contrast, and contrast has now thinned beyond usefulness. The universe does not transition into something else after this point. It does not cross a boundary that separates one mode of being from another. Instead, it remains within the same condition indefinitely, not because it is constrained, but because nothing remains that could pull it toward an alternative. What persists is not a final chapter, but the absence of chapters altogether. In this state, the last meaningful distinction between persistence and repetition dissolves. Repetition once implied a cycle. a recognizable return to an earlier configuration. Persistence now has no such structure. Nothing returns because nothing ever leaves. There is no looping, no rhythm, no cadence that could be recognized as repetition. The universe does not repeat itself. It simply continues to be itself in a way that no longer produces identifiable moments. This continuation also erases the final role of rhythm. Rhythm requires periodicity, a pattern of variation that repeats over time. In the far future, variation exists, but it does not repeat in any structured way. Fluctuations occur, but they do not form cycles. Without cycles, there is no rhythm. Time loses its beat. It flows without pulse, without emphasis, without segmentation. The loss of rhythm also dissolves the last sense of pacing. Pacing implies that something is happening faster or slower, relative to something else. In the far future, nothing progresses toward anything. Speed becomes irrelevant. A process unfolding over 1 trillion years is no different in consequence from one unfolding over a single moment. Duration no longer confers weight. Time stretches without urgency and without delay. This absence of pacing reframes the idea of patience. Patience implies waiting for an outcome. In the far future, there is no outcome to wait for. The universe does not wait. Waiting requires expectation, and expectation requires difference between now and later. That difference no longer exists. The universe exists in a perpetual present that is indistinguishable from its future. This perpetual present does not imply timelessness. Time still exists. It still orders events. What disappears is the relevance of that ordering. The universe does not accumulate experience as time passes. It does not build history. Each moment exists without inheriting anything from the last. Time becomes an index without memory. The disappearance of memory removes the final basis for identity at every scale. Identity once meant continuity across time, the persistence of recognizable patterns. In the far future, patterns do not persist. Any structure that briefly appears dissolves before it can be reinforced. Identity becomes impossible, not because things are destroyed, but because nothing remains long enough to be recognized again. This dissolution of identity also erases the last framework for continuity of self, even in principle. There is no thing that continues as itself from one moment to the next in any meaningful sense. Existence is no longer composed of entities, it is composed of occurrences without owners. The absence of owners dissolves the final notion of agency. Agency implies that something acts, that it initiates change. In the far future, actions occur, but there are no agents. Events happen without actors. Processes unfold without initiators. The universe does not act upon itself. It simply follows what is allowed by its constraints. These constraints, however, remain fully intact. Physical law does not weaken. Conservation, symmetry, probability, and causality continue to operate. What changes is not the rules, but the context in which they apply. The laws are now applied to a universe that no longer contains the conditions required for these laws to generate structure. Law becomes descriptive rather than productive. This reveals a subtle but important distinction. The universe does not become lawless. It becomes law-saturated. Everything that happens is fully consistent with law, but law no longer produces variety. The rules remain expressive in principle, but their expression converges into sameness. This convergence dissolves the final role of unpredictability as something meaningful. Unpredictability once mattered because different outcomes led to different futures. In the far future, unpredictability remains at the microscopic level, but it does not propagate. Whether an event occurs one way or another does not alter the global condition. Randomness persists without consequence. The absence of consequence also erases the final role of risk. Risk implies that outcomes could be better or worse. In the far future, outcomes are equivalent. Nothing is gained. Nothing is lost. The universe does not face danger. It does not avoid it. Danger requires vulnerability, and vulnerability requires structure that can be damaged. Structure no longer persists. This persistence without structure reframes the idea of fragility one last time. Fragility once meant susceptibility to damage. In the far future, nothing is fragile because nothing can be damaged in a way that matters. There are no delicate arrangements to break, no rare configurations to destroy. The universe becomes robust through indifference. This indifference also dissolves the last role of preservation. Preservation implies that something is worth maintaining. In the far future, nothing requires preservation. Nothing decays into something worse. Nothing improves into something better. The universe does not conserve its state intentionally. It simply remains because there is no mechanism that would remove it. The absence of preservation also erases the final meaning of loss. Loss implies that something valuable has been removed. In the far future, nothing is valuable in a comparative sense. Value required scarcity, memory, and consequence. All three are gone. The universe does not lose anything because there is nothing left to lose. This absence of loss also dissolves the final trace of nostalgia. Nostalgia requires memory of a past that was meaningfully different. The universe does not remember its past. It does not look back on eras of stars or galaxies with longing. Those eras existed, but their existence does not leave a trace in the far future, beyond the laws that allowed them. The fading of memory does not erase the beginning of everything. The beginning is not remembered, but it remains embedded in the structure of reality. The constants, symmetries, and geometry that defined the early universe still define the late universe. Nothing contradicts the beginning. Everything that remains is consistent with it. This consistency reveals that the far future is not a deviation from the universe's original nature. It is its full expression. The early universe was dramatic because it was far from equilibrium. The late universe is quiet because it has approached equilibrium as closely as possible without eliminating existence itself. Existence itself does not vanish because there is no process that removes it entirely. Energy does not disappear, fields do not vanish, space does not collapse into nothing, time does not end. The universe continues because there is no end point written into its rules. This continuation does not require justification. It does not need to answer why it exists. The question of why something exists rather than nothing presumes that nothing is an alternative state the universe could occupy. It is not. There is no mechanism that replaces existence with nothingness. The universe therefore does not arrive at emptiness. Emptiness implies absence relative to presence. Presence remains everywhere. What disappears is structure, not substance. What fades is contrast, not reality. This is why the far future cannot be described as silent, dark, or dead. Those are experiential terms that require observers. Without observers, those descriptions lose meaning. The universe is not silent because silence implies the absence of sound relative to hearing. Hearing no longer exists. It is not dark because darkness implies the absence of light relative to sight. Sight no longer exists. What remains is existence without reference. Reality persists without being framed against alternatives. It does not define itself as something rather than something else. It simply continues under laws that no longer generate distinction. This condition does not feel like an ending because endings require closure. Closure implies that something has been resolved. The universe was never trying to resolve anything. It was always following rules that lead, inevitably, to this state. The far future, therefore, is not a conclusion. It is the absence of the need for conclusions. The universe doesn't close its story because stories were never part of its structure. They were temporary overlays created by complexity. When complexity fades, the overlays fade with it. Reality remains unchanged. Existence persists, not as a narrative unfolding, not as a problem being solved, but as a condition that holds indefinitely. No final act, no ultimate scene, no last transformation, just continuity, extended beyond the point where change matters, beyond the point where meaning applies, beyond the point where endings make sense. This is not the universe after everything ends. It is the universe after endings themselves have lost relevance. Existence carries on beyond even this point without encountering any final threshold that could justify calling what follows an ending, because the universe has long since passed beyond the conditions that make endings meaningful. What remains is not a closing act or a terminal state, but the steady expression of reality once every mechanism capable of producing emphasis has faded. The universe does not arrive anywhere. It does not settle into a destination. It simply continues, not as a journey, but as a condition that holds because nothing interrupts it. In this final regime, the idea that reality must be heading toward something dissolves completely. Direction implies a difference between where one is and where one is going. That difference no longer exists. The universe is not approaching a future that differs meaningfully from its present. Every moment is statistically equivalent to every other. Time still advances, but advancement no longer accumulates into change. The universe flows without moving forward in any way that matters. This reveals the last transformation of time itself. Earlier, time was an engine. It separated states, allowed processes to unfold, and gave rise to history. In the far future, time becomes a background coordinate. It orders events without creating narrative. Nothing depends on timing. Nothing becomes more or less significant because of when it occurs. Time continues, but it no longer sculpts reality. With the loss of temporal sculpting, the final basis for history disappears. History required memory, persistence, and consequence. Events had to leave marks that shaped what followed. In the far future, events do not leave marks. They do not alter trajectories. They do not build upon one another. History collapses into an unstructured sequence of occurrences without inheritance. The universe does not remember itself, not because memory was erased, but because memory was never a property of reality itself. This absence of memory dissolves the final illusion of continuity as something experiential. Continuity once meant that something carried itself forward through time. In the far future, continuity becomes purely structural. Reality continues without carrying anything with it. There is no identity that spans moments. There is only existence renewing itself instant by instant, without reference to what came before. The disappearance of reference points also eliminates the final role of comparison. Comparison depends on at least two states that differ in a way that matters. In the far future, differences persist only as fleeting fluctuations that do not propagate. Comparison becomes informationally possible but practically meaningless. Nothing is better, worse is earlier, later, larger or smaller in any way that affects the whole. All distinctions flatten into equivalence of outcome. This equivalence erases the last trace of hierarchy. Hierarchy once structured the universe, from massive objects shaping smaller ones to energetic systems dominating quieter ones. In the far future, nothing dominates anything else. Influence cannot propagate far enough to matter. Everything exists on the same footing, not because it has been equalized by force, but because influence itself has become irrelevant. Without influence, the idea of power collapses. Power implies the capacity to shape outcomes. In the far future, no outcome can be shaped in a lasting way. Power does not vanish as a forbidden concept. It becomes undefined. Nothing has power because there is nothing left that can be powered. This loss of power also dissolves the final framework for control. Control requires the ability to guide a system toward a desired state. The universe does not contain desired states. It does not contain goals. It does not contain preferences. Control was never a property of reality itself. It emerged within localized systems navigating constrained environments. Once those systems fade, control loses context. The fading of context also erases the last role of responsibility. Responsibility implies that actions carry consequences that matter. In the far future, actions do not carry consequences beyond themselves. Nothing is responsible for anything else. The universe does not hold itself accountable. Accountability requires standards, and standards require comparison. Both are gone. This condition reveals something subtle but profound about the nature of existence. Reality does not require meaning to persist. Meaning was an emergent overlay created by minds operating within a narrow range of conditions. Once those conditions vanish, meaning vanishes without affecting reality. The universe does not become meaningless in a tragic sense. It becomes meaning-independent. Existence carries on beyond even this point without encountering any final threshold that could justify calling what follows an ending, because the universe has long since passed beyond the conditions that make endings meaningful. What remains is not a closing act or a terminal state, but the steady expression of reality once every mechanism capable of producing emphasis has faded. The universe does not arrive anywhere. It does not settle into a destination. It simply continues, not as a journey, but as a condition that holds because nothing interrupts it. In this final regime, the idea that reality must be heading toward something dissolves completely. Direction implies a difference between where one is and where one is going. That difference no longer exists. The universe is not approaching a future that differs meaningfully from its present. Every moment is statistically equivalent to every other. Time still advances, but advancement no longer accumulates into change. The universe flows without moving forward in any way that matters. This reveals the last transformation of time itself. Earlier, time was an engine. It separated states, allowed processes to unfold, and gave rise to history. In the far future, time becomes a background coordinate. It orders events without creating narrative. Nothing depends on timing. Nothing becomes more or less significant because of when it occurs. Time continues, but it no longer sculpts reality. With the loss of temporal sculpting, the final basis for history disappears. History required memory, persistence, and consequence. Events had to leave marks that shaped what followed. In the far future, events do not leave marks. They do not alter trajectories. They do not build upon one another. History collapses into an unstructured sequence of occurrences without inheritance. The universe does not remember itself, not because memory was erased, but because memory was never a property of reality itself. This absence of memory dissolves the final illusion of continuity as something experiential. Continuity once meant that something carried itself forward through time. In the far future, continuity becomes purely structural. Reality continues without carrying anything with it. There is no identity that spans moments. There is only existence renewing itself instant by instant, without reference to what came before. The disappearance of reference points also eliminates the final role of comparison. Comparison depends on at least two states that differ in a way that matters. In the far future, differences persist only as fleeting fluctuations that do not propagate. Comparison becomes informationally possible but practically meaningless. Nothing is better, worse is earlier, later, larger or smaller in any way that affects the whole. All distinctions flatten into equivalence of outcome. This equivalence erases the last trace of hierarchy. Hierarchy once structured the universe, from massive objects shaping smaller ones to energetic systems dominating quieter ones. In the far future, nothing dominates anything else. Influence cannot propagate far enough to matter. Everything exists on the same footing, not because it has been equalized by force, but because influence itself has become irrelevant. Without influence, the idea of power collapses. Power implies the capacity to shape outcomes. In the far future, no outcome can be shaped in a lasting way. Power does not vanish as a forbidden concept. It becomes undefined. Nothing has power because there is nothing left that can be powered. This loss of power also dissolves the final framework for control. Control requires the ability to guide a system toward a desired state. The universe does not contain desired states. It does not contain goals. It does not contain preferences. Control was never a property of reality itself. It emerged within localized systems navigating constrained environments. Once those systems fade, control loses context. The fading of context also erases the last role of responsibility. Responsibility implies that actions carry consequences that matter. In the far future, actions do not carry consequences beyond themselves. Nothing is responsible for anything else. The universe does not hold itself accountable. Accountability requires standards, and standards require comparison. Both are gone. This condition reveals something subtle but profound about the nature of existence. Reality does not require meaning to persist. Meaning was an emergent overlay created by minds operating within a narrow range of conditions. Once those conditions vanish, meaning vanishes without affecting reality. The universe does not become meaningless in a tragic sense. It becomes meaning independent.